Good afternoon. I am Demetra Scott with Beresford Booth. I'm the chair of the Family Law Group, and today's discussion is going to be centered around adoption issues, in particular, your pre-adoption home study. A pre-placement report is required by Washington state law before a child can be placed in a household with a family for adoption purposes. And I thought it would be best to go over some of the commonly asked questions about pre-placement studies or home studies with someone who knows a lot more about them than me. I have with me today Joan Ward. She is a Washington state licensed independent clinical social worker who has provided services to families and children for over 30 years. According to her website, although I suspect this is much higher, she's conducted more than 1,000 adoption-related services and home studies in her career, and I've had the pleasure of working with her on quite a few adoptions here in Washington state and for our interstate clients as well. So I'm going to turn it over to ask Joan a few questions that commonly come across my desk. And Joan, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you.
Joan, can you tell us a little bit from your own words or your own perspective, what is a pre-adoption home study?
So most states, and certainly Washington state, requires something called a pre-placement or home study. There are terms, the same terms for the same thing. And if you're working with other states, sometimes they're called family assessments. So there's really a whole variety of labels for them, but in our statutes, we call them a pre-placement report. And basically, statutes, and also I try to follow the WACs for Department of Children, Youth, and Families, because I find that if you're working with different court systems, that it's probably combining the two can be the most helpful and universal home study. And basically, it is looking at the suitability of a person to adopt a child. It would include their health, financial resources, personal resources, the stability of their relationships if they're married or in a domestic partnership of some kind. So it's just basically, I always tell people that if you look at RCW 33190, it's like looking at a cookbook. And with new social workers, I tell them, if you just look at that, you can do really a home study just based on that.
Very good. So if a client wants to adopt and they need to have a home study conducted, is there anything they should do to prepare themselves for your home study?
Well, Washington doesn't, all states that I'm aware of require preparation for adoption. And Washington does not have a set number of hours. Many, many states require around 10 hours, some states 12. So I usually have my clients start, after I find out what kind of adoption they're looking at, I have them do some kind of preparation for adoption. And usually, to me, it's almost like common sense. If someone's trying to adopt a newborn and they're going through an agency or an adoption facilitator or advertising, that nowadays they really need to be aware of drug and alcohol in utero and the impact on children. They need to be aware of cultural issues. And I think that's become more and more important. And I'm seeing that required in home studies now in many states. They need to learn about relationships of birth parents. Some people will have an ongoing relationship with a birth parent. Some may never meet them, but it's still important that they understand that. It's important that they understand the risks associated with adoption. There certainly can be joys associated with adoption, but there's many, many risks. And I think that that's increasing with the internet. It's always been, the potential for a scam has always been out there, but I think that the more people work with online facilitators or could be an agency, that they really need to know, the possible problems that are associated with that. So that would be the minimum. Usually people will have some kind of education on positive adoption language. I like people to have preparation on child development, especially infant brain development. So those would be like the minimum things. And then depending upon what they're looking at pursuing, if it be a relative's adoption or a international adoption or whatever it may be, then I may ask them to do some kind of preparation that really would focus on that kind of adoption that they're doing. The adoption preparation, there are companies that do online for $100, $150. You can do 10 credits. I put together packets for my clients if at no cost, if they want to do it with just my training materials. They can go to other agencies to get their training. And there's actually a caregiver course that's been offered by the state, usually provided by their contracted agencies. And that's about 24 hours, and they can certainly go through that. And that focuses very much on foster to adopt.
Perfect. So approximately how long does it take to complete a home study? And what are the factors that might impact that time frame?
People ask me that probably every phone call I get with a potential client. And I always tell them it's really more their timeline than it is mine. I tend to do mine as soon as the paperwork starts coming back. And some people, have one expedited home study, and I've had them turned around within 24 to 48 hours. That's the exception. But I'd say if somebody's really wanting to do a home study on an expedited basis, a couple of weeks, some people take 6 months. And if it takes that long, it's because they're taking their time getting doctor's appointments, getting background clearances. So it's really up to them more than it is me. And I think, that's as an independent social worker, not working with the agency. Agencies can take much longer.
You mentioned as part of the home study, this investigative component into the fitness of the parent or the family for purposes of adoption. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do or what you look at to determine their fitness?
Well, there's 3 mandatory background clearances for a Washington adoption, and that's one through the FBI, which is fingerprint based, one through the Washington State Patrol, and one through Department of Children, Youth, and Families, which is their child abuse and neglect. And if a person has lived in another state within the past 5 years, we also do the background child abuse and neglect check. And I try to do a criminal records check through their state agency, whatever that may be. There's references, which may or may not be helpful because they pick who's going to be their reference. But we're also looking at things like if they have been had other children. Oftentimes I'll have somebody petitioning to adopt a child when they have relinquished a child from a prior relationship. If there are parenting plans, I often look at their parenting plans. So it really can be a variety of things. If they've had histories of drug and alcohol abuse or criminal histories, I look at how long ago that was and what that person may have done to change that behavior or, to address those problems. Certainly it's not unusual anymore to find somebody that was, convicted of drug possession or GUI. And I really look at the length of time on that. And if it's been more recent, get letters from sponsors or treatment providers. So it really depends.
So having a potential criminal charge years ago isn't an automatic disqualifier from being able to adopt. Is that right?
Not at all. And, I've had a lot of clients that had old marijuana possession charges from 10, 15 years ago. And, I'm not particularly concerned about that as long as they're not still actively engaging in problematic substance abuse.
Very good. You mentioned something about doctor's appointments. What kind of doctor's appointments do they have to go to?
Well, it's interesting because in the statute, they talk about a physician, but even though that's in the statute, I know from working at King County Superior Court, that we were accepting naturopaths, nurse practitioners, PAs. So I think in general now, it doesn't have to be a physician. Most of my clients see whoever their primary care provider is and have a form completed. And it's a fairly, there's two formats that I use. One is the old medical format that King County Superior Court used when they had an active adoption department. And then Washington State Department of Children, Youth, and Families has a medical form. I may use that if I know they're going to be doing an interstate adoption. And I may use the old court form for a domestic or local adoption, step-parent adoptions, and things like that. But it's not, I tell people you don't have to have lab tests. There's nothing, it can be based on past medical history, especially during COVID. Most of the people are taking the forms to a doctor they've seen in the past. And as long as that doctor is comfortable completing the form, I'm fine with that. Sorry, my dogs are in the backyard.
All right. Speaking of pets, if I have pets, dogs, other, more exotic pets, should I be concerned about that in the home study process?
Something I've started doing just in the past few years, and it's because of interstate adoption, is some states require vet records. And so now if somebody is, not for step parents, but for, I usually require the vet records just to make sure that the animal's getting care and has been vaccinated and so forth. And for the most part, I don't think animals are all a problem unless I go out to do the home visit and there's something that raises a red flag for me. Some of that would include if I went out to a home and it looked like an animal was being neglected or abused, that would raise a big red flag. The other thing is, pit bulls or an animal that could present, a potential danger to a person. And then I really am looking at how that dog interacts with me and also vet records, how often that dog has been around other children. So it's really a variety of factors. It doesn't come up as a problem very often.
Very good. Okay, so now you mentioned a home visit. So how often are you going to homes during the home study process? Is it one visit? Is it multiple visits? What's that look like?
That's changed a little bit too because of COVID. And for pre-placement, there's a mandatory home visit. And it's really to see the environment. I tell people it's not a, white glove inspection. I'm not looking for dust bunnies. It would just really be that the house is basically safe. Common sense things. If you look at the state Department of Children, Youth, and Families, they have a checklist that they use. And I typically use that checklist, and it's looking for working smoke detectors. I like it when people have carbon monoxide detector, a working fire extinguisher. For condos, a lot of them are right outside the home, and that's acceptable. But it's really trying to, like I said, I use the state's checklist. So it's not, they don't have to have everything baby-proof. That's not necessary. But we discussed that. And, if I have any concerns about them understanding what that may entail, then we discuss that.
So what if I have a multi-generational family or roommates? Do they have to be involved in the home study process?
If you have a home that has a separate apartment in it with a separate entrance, they do not. But if they live in the same home, every person 18 and over would be part of it. Background clearances, interviews, and so forth.
So that could include my adult children if they still live with me.
Yes.
Yeah.
If they're over 18. Okay.
So they have to be willing to consent to the criminal background check as well.
Yes.
Okay. If I come to you for a home study, can that home study be used for an international adoption?
It depends. I get asked that a lot, and I usually decline to do international because it's so many changes over the years, and there's so many agencies involved. Oftentimes I have people that live in Washington, and they're working with a an agency in another state that does adoptions with certain countries. Lately, I've done 2 or 3 home studies for people that are adopting children from Africa.
Mhm.
And what I do is they have to be an agency that it's accredited by, it could be a Hague case. If it's not a Hague country, it could be an orphan. But they have to be accredited, and then I work under that agency's supervision.
Mhm.
So essentially, I do the home study. I add any requirements that the foreign country or that agency or the state that that agency is based in has. And it's usually a very, very lengthy, complicated process. But yes, I'll only do those if I'm working under the umbrella of another agency.
Very good. Once a child's been placed in my home, or in a client's home, I should say, you've completed the pre-adoption home study, they've had a great successful match, child is placed in their home. Can they then call you for purposes of doing the post-placement follow-up?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about just what a post-placement report is and how it differs from the home study?
So any adoption of a child requires a post-placement. Not all adoptions require pre-placement. So it just depends. Like if it's a step-parent adoption, at this point, because of COVID, we've gone to really just video conferencing. And that's been accepted by the courts. But other kinds of post-placements, I try, even during COVID, I've been trying to go out and if I've not met the child, to see the child. And I'll do that for somebody else that's done the pre, or I do it as a follow-up to mine. Also, I get a lot of grandparent or relative adoptions. It could be a guardian, it could be a third party, but it's somebody other than a parent of a child that's adopting. More often than not, it's related to drugs and alcohol, a death of the parents. And those we usually do a kind of a combined pre and post placement. There's the post placement, but usually I try to include the elements of a pre placement in that as well. And usually that would mean a home visit.
Very good. Are there any other questions that you're asked often or frequently? Anything else you'd like people to know about your process and the adoption, your role in the adoption process?
No, I think the most frequent questions I get asked is how much does it cost and what's included. And I'd say most people, your clients have to get their own FBI clearance because we're not able to get that, whereas they are. So that's probably one thing for families to know that that's something they have to obtain on their own. The length of time very much is going to be up to them and their paperwork. I get a lot of questions from people wanting to know how to find a child. And that's just, even people where I've done the home study, they try one method for a while or work with one facilitator or an attorney. And, I think that may be the toughest question now is how does it work? And so I see people sometimes like switching gears and going from one method to the next. I think the other thing that's important for people to know is that home studies are good for a certain length of time before they need to be updated. And there are certain things, and once again, the WACs that are written for Department of Children, Youth, and Families does a really good job of saying what those changes are. But would it be like a change in household makeup, like somebody's moved in, somebody's moved out? It could be a new job. It could be a new home and you need a new home visit. So it really depends. Your medicals need to, especially for interstate, your medicals need to be updated annually, background clearances. So I think that surprises some families because they, are asked to update that. And, for some people that, just takes them by surprise.
Sure. And even depending on the state, if they're doing an interstate adoption, they could even have a requirement for clearances, in particular the criminal clearances, more recent than a year. It could be 6 months. And so there's got to be some flexibility.
Yeah. And that can vary by local rule too. Like King County is, 6 months. So Yeah, this probably wouldn't impact you, but I see a growing number of people doing adoptions pro se, which can be, challenging. A lot of people are English as a second language immigrants. So that may not impact attorneys as much, but I do see that as a growing area, especially watching, the evacuations from Afghanistan. You just think about waves of different populations of people from different countries and all kinds of orphan immigrations and so forth.
Absolutely. Well, Joan, thank you for joining us today. And you can find Joan either through reaching out to me. I'm happy to give you her contact information. She's also available just through a regular Google search.
Yeah. Or my dog through Edmonds.
There you go. Right there. You'll see her walking through Edmonds. Thank you for joining us, Joan. We appreciate it.
Take care.
Take care.